On the car ride here, I was talking to somebody, who was there yesterday morning when we had the book launch. She had read last night the chapter that was called Compassion Fatigue. So we were talking about that. And I was telling her that actually when somebody in the US commented to me that, using the term compassion fatigue isn't quite accurate. The idea being that if you're really practicing pure compassion, you don't get burnt out. And, if your compassion is pure, you're really full of energy to keep on helping, okay? On the other hand, we do have bodies, and our bodies get exhausted. Yeah, our bodies can get fatigued. So we have to learn how to balance helping others with our own physical state. Yeah. And that can be a challenge because some of us are not very used to paying attention to our bodies, and knowing when we need to rest. We just keep pushing. So, this is actually a practice too, to stop and check in with our body. When am I tired? When do I need to sleep? Okay. And so that's one element. The other element is sometimes, of course we're compassionate people, but sometimes people keep asking us for help, and there's so many good causes, so many charities, so many people in need of help, and we want to help everybody. So sometimes we overcommit ourselves. Yeah, we have compassion, but we don't stop and think, do I have the time to do all these things? Do I have the capability to do all of these things? And instead we push ourselves to keep doing things. Sometimes because we have a good intention and we really want to help. Sometimes because one part of us says, you better help. If you don't help, you're selfish. And we feel guilty if we don't say yes. But then it's very possible in that situation that we say yes to everything people ask us to do, every charity who needs help, or every temple who needs help. And then, if we do it out of obligation or guilt, then our motivation isn't completely compassionate. And after a while, mentally we become resentful, yeah, and physically we get exhausted. And neither of those mental or physical states are really conducive to carrying out a compassionate intention. So it's really important, again, for us to check in and see, what am I capable of doing? And what kind of time frame is necessary? And do I have the skills to do it? Do I have the physical strength? Yeah, because if we get ourselves so exhausted, then instead of being able to help anybody else, they have to pick us up off the floor. Yeah? So, we have to remember that compassion applies to ourself as well. Yeah. Also in this light, another way that sometimes people go wrong in cultivating compassion is they feel like if I'm happy, then I can't be truly compassionate. That in order to be really compassionate, I have to be suffering. Yeah? That's wrong. That's wrong, okay? Actually, when we're truly compassionate, when we have a really pure motivation, then we feel totally delighted and happy and blissful to be able to help. Okay? So first of all, don't think that compassion means that you have to suffer. Yeah? And don't think that if you're not suffering, you can't be truly compassionate. Yeah? But, let yourself enjoy being compassionate, and when it's time to stop, it's perfectly okay to say, I would like to help, but I'm sorry I'm unable to. Yeah? And personally speaking, because I work a lot with people who volunteer at the Abbey, we depend on volunteers. And I much prefer somebody to say, I would like to help, but I can't, than to promise that they're going to help without really checking if they can, and then not being able to help in the end, and then we're left high and dry. I would much rather people, from a even practical viewpoint, just to say when they can't do it. And, we really want people to take care of themselves. Because you have to take care of yourself so that you can be of benefit to others. It's not an either-or thing, that either I care for myself or I care for others. Yeah, we want to make it an and thing. I care for myself and I care for others. Okay? And as as I was saying, the more we practice compassion, the more we enjoy it. So then, even if you have to sacrifice a little bit of your own happiness, immediate happiness, for the long-term benefit of somebody else, you don't feel pain and dismay at doing that. You feel happy. Okay? So this is how a bodhisattva feels. Of course, we are not all bodhisattvas. Okay? Yeah, so we have to be practical and see what we can do and what we can't. But, to have the ideal that we aim for, slowly to build up to, is, to not worry so much about our own self, and let that self-centeredness impede us from being of benefit to others, but instead being able to overcome that kind of self-centeredness, to be of service and to enjoy being of service. Okay? So I hope you don't see anything I'm saying as contradictory, because I was saying sometimes you have to sacrifice your own immediate pleasure to be of benefit. That does not mean you make yourself exhausted, okay? It just means maybe you have to eat lunch an hour later. That's what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about sacrificing yourself so much that, like I said before, you're flat out and then other people have to take care of you. Yeah. But I'm talking about overcoming this very extreme self-centeredness that we often have, where we have to be comfortable at all costs. And our happiness, even the teeniest happiness, matters more than anybody else's. Okay? That kind of self-centeredness really impedes us from growing in the Dharma. And it impedes us from being of benefit and service. So that's the self-centeredness that at the beginning stages we really have to work with. As we progress, there's different layers of self-centeredness we work with. But let's just start with that one. The mind that says, I want what I want when I want it. You know that mind? Yeah? I want it now. And the universe owes it to me. And if the universe doesn't give me what I want, if you don't give me what I want, I'm going to let you know I'm really unhappy. And so we throw an adult version of a temper tantrum. Okay? Kids are much more honest. When they throw a temper tantrum, they just yell and scream. My parents, when I was like, I don't know, maybe 4 years old, I was trying to put on some roller skates. These were in the days when you had to screw the roller skates onto your shoes. Yeah. And I couldn't do it properly. And I couldn't get the skates to stay on. And I was so frustrated that I just sat there and threw the skates down. And my parents had a movie camera, and they have a movie of me having a temper tantrum at 4 years old. Yeah. So, being embarrassed by that movie, I have been able to refine my temper tantrums. Yeah. So, I don't look like I'm throwing a temper tantrum, but I'm actually throwing a temper tantrum and manipulating everybody so that they'll give me what I want, or being really assertive, really. Yeah. Of course, for women, you're not supposed to be like that, so we just kind of manipulate. The men just go, and don't care who they run down. Yeah? These are big generalizations. But, the idea is to notice that tendency in ourselves to just be so extremely self-centered, and to see how that causes us unhappiness right now. Yeah, this is a big thing for us, because we usually think that our self-centeredness is going to make us happy. You know how they say, if I don't take care of myself, who's going to take care of me? Yeah, so I've got to get everything I want. It's a little bit extreme. And that extreme self-centeredness makes me interpret everything in the universe according to how it affects me. And that's really not very open-minded, is it? Because I'm one of 7 billion human beings. So why should everything be interpreted in terms of me? Yeah? There's, believe it or not, other people in this universe who have feelings just like me, who want to be happy and not suffer just like me. Yeah? So it's much more reasonable to care about the welfare of everybody. Yeah, work for the welfare of everybody, instead of making myself so miserable by just caring about myself. Okay? Because like I said, when we just care about ourselves, then every small thing, oh, they didn't say good morning to me. That means, they don't like me, they're being rude, how dare they treat me like that, blah, 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 blah. We make up a whole big story. Yeah. Whereas they're not saying good morning has nothing to do with it. Okay? So to really, I read something once that said that they were kind of 4 specific things that people really push on. One is there's one kind of, we all have all 4, but there's one that we may have stronger than the others. So one is, I have to be comfortable. Yeah. I don't like sitting here without a cushion. Yeah. Why doesn't BF have more cushions for me to sit on? Didn't they know I was coming this morning? Yeah. Yeah. And the aircon isn't strong enough. Oh, So this mind that has to be comfortable at all costs. Okay. Second thing is we have to be loved and appreciated. That's what we're attached to. Everybody has to appreciate me. Okay. So if I give my cushion to somebody else, then they better turn around and say, Thank you so much. You are very kind. You are very generous. You must be a bodhisattva. You're the You're the kindest person in the universe. I want to hear lots of praise. Yeah, if I do even, just something small, I need to be congratulated, praised, acknowledged. Yeah. Third thing, very attached to, I've got to be right. Yeah? If we're having a discussion, my viewpoint is right. Why? Because it's mine. Yeah. And I would never believe anything wrong. And so even if I change my mind and believe something different tomorrow, I'm still right. Okay? And so you better realize that I'm right and stop pushing the argument and just do things my way. Yeah? Some of you have that problem? Okay? Fourth one is we've got to win. We're very involved in comparing ourselves to others or comparing ourselves to anything. And we've always got to win and come out on top. I'll give you an extreme version of this. Somebody was telling me recently, she lives in Seattle, and she was riding her bicycle. She usually takes a bus, but that day she was riding her bike. And as she was going on the street, the bus was kind of even with her, and she wanted to compete with the bus to see if she could get home quicker on her bike. And she said to me, wow, I never realized how competitive I am. Yeah. And so, some people very competitive. They have to win at all cost. Yeah. Playing a game cannot be for enjoyment. It has to be for victory. Yeah. Having a discussion can not be something that we share on. It has to be that I win. Okay. So, all these kinds of things, the self-centered mind lies behind this, and it actually makes us quite miserable, as well as ruins our relationships. Yeah. Now, I'm sure you can think of at least 100 people who have these problems. But we're not actually talking about those 100 people who you want to give the tape of this talk to, so that they can correct their faults. We're actually talking about ourselves, because we're the only ones that we can even remotely try and manage or change. Yes, we have to look at ourselves, apply the antidote to self-centeredness to ourselves. Okay? So I can go on and on about this, but I think I should give Russell a chance. Otherwise, I'm going to look bad because I'll be so self-centered, and then my reputation will be ruined, and I don't want that.
It's very nice to see you all here. As I was listening to you speak, Venerable Chodron, there were a couple things that came to mind. The first thought was the idea of how we can have misconceptions about what compassion is and what it isn't. And so I think that probably we all have an understanding that compassion isn't easy, that it involves coming face to face with suffering and trying to help. But I think one of the things about compassion that can be surprising to us is that it can be not easy in ways that we didn't expect, and not so difficult in ways that we didn't expect. So some of the things that we thought would be very difficult, actually, the more we practice it, become quite easy. And some of the things that we didn't even anticipate become the difficulties. And I think one of those things, Venerable Chodron started out by talking about compassion fatigue. And I think sometimes when we think the difficulty of compassion is all the work I'm going to have to do for others. And what she said was very important. When we really feel compassion, that doesn't feel like so much work at all. It feels joyful. But I think what can be very tricky, the stuff that can be very difficult, is the need to be honest with ourselves about what we need, what we can do, what we cannot do, and to extend compassion to ourselves and to pay attention when, I don't have enough time to do this, or I don't have enough energy, I'm feeling depleted, and to be able to do that. And I've learned one of the things that's really great about doing things like this and being invited to do lots of things like this, it's very difficult to say no to things that I don't want to do. I struggle with that. When someone asks me to do something I don't want to do, it's hard to say no to that. But it's even more difficult to say no to things that I'd very much like to do. And I can't. I don't have the time, I don't have the energy, I don't have the resources, right? And so I'd like to suggest to you that taking care of yourself is part of compassion. Having compassion, you said we can have compassion for others and for ourselves. We can care for ourselves and care for others. I would suggest that if you care about others and you want to have compassion for them and be effective in that compassion, we have to care for ourselves. I mean, think about it. Venerable Chodron was talking about this idea that to be compassionate, we have to suffer. And it makes sense that we would get that idea. I mean, if we look at the roots of the word compassion, it's to suffer with. And that tells us something very important about compassion, that it starts with the courage to approach the suffering of others, the suffering of ourselves, and a willingness to work with that. And there's actually, I'm a psychologist, so I'm going to put some science in here occasionally. There's actually cells in your brain called mirror neurons. And when we see other people who are feeling strong emotions, who are suffering, it gives us an echo of that ourselves. We can even feel a little bit of it. But think about it. If you really needed help, do you think it would be more helpful to be helped by someone who was overwhelmed by your misery? Or would it be more helpful to have someone who cared deeply about your suffering and your misery, but who also brought with them a sense of positivity and hope and encouragement, right? And so we have to have both. We have to have the willing to connect with the suffering and to understand that allowing ourselves to be overwhelmed by it doesn't help, that actually we have to bring the light into the darkness. That's part of us sharing our compassion. We get to be the light and to not feel bad about that. And I know that sometimes as a psychologist, as a therapist, I have folks who go through different situations that were very difficult for them, but maybe it was worse for somebody else. Maybe they went to war and they came back and survived, but their buddy died. Or they were in a car wreck and their sister passed away or was terribly injured and they weren't injured. And sometimes people will feel terrible guilt that others were hurt, other people had it worse than me. And they may even criticize themselves. They may feel like, I shouldn't feel joy, I shouldn't have any happiness in my life. It's disrespectful to those who are suffering for me to feel joy or light in my life. And the problem with that is if we emotionally cripple ourselves in that way, we also cripple our ability to help others. So really, if you're committed to cultivating compassion in your life, then you have to be committed to supporting your own well-being, to keeping your body healthy, to saying no when you need to say no. And that's a difficulty maybe we don't anticipate when we start on the road to compassion, the difficulty of having to say no, having to actually not do things we'd like to do, and to be honest with ourselves, The other thing that you were saying that I thought was really important is this idea of what you said, everything you said was important, but the stuff that stood out for me this idea of how we can so easily shift into a self-focused frame of mind where our motivation becomes about achieving our goals or defending ourselves against things that happen. And I think sometimes when we hear, one of the things that is really nice in psychology and in psychological science these years is that although it's taken us 2,500 years to catch up, the science is really beginning to examine the things that the Buddha and the followers of the Buddha have been saying for 2,500 years. So we use different words. Instead of aversion, we say experiential avoidance. Right? You have to use very fancy words, you know. But it's the same thing. Moving away from things that make you uncomfortable, right? So we talk about attachment and aversion in the same, and the thing that I think is good, we're not all good at this, but I think more and more scientists are being honest with ourselves and saying, you know, we didn't invent these ideas. We're borrowing this wisdom, and then we're examining it through the set of tools and the lens that we have so that we can give scientific verification to what Buddhist practice has been bearing true for many centuries. And that's very important because as a scientist, we need that. I need that. I think it's an opportunity for these teachings to go beyond religion and to impact the culture because, again, the science is bearing this out. But when Venerable Chodron was talking about these tendencies and how we tend to think, my opinion, I'm always right, what I want is most important, if I don't like it, it shouldn't happen. Sometimes we actually have those thoughts. Sometimes we actually think, I'm more important than you. But I would actually bet that many of you experience that fairly rarely. I would bet that most of you get up in the morning and don't think, I'm going to be very selfish today. You know, I bet most of the people in this room don't look at other people thinking, well, I'm just a lot more important than you. You know, you folks should all just do what I want. I think most folks don't do that. I think most of us, actually, when we feel safe and when we're in the context of people who care about us, in the abstract, our intentions towards others are usually pretty good. But the problem is that we have a lot of emotions that arise within us when we pay attention to different things. And it's very easy when this happens to shift, even without thinking, even without being aware of it, to shift into a state of mind that isn't at all compassionate and isn't at all helpful, right? So it's like, I care about everybody. I care about everybody. I care about, ooh, I want that. And before we know it, it's not that we're thinking, oh, I don't care about anybody anymore. It's just they fall off the radar because that's what I want, right? And to an extent, this is part of how our emotions play out in the brain and in our minds, right? When I'm in a classroom and I'm talking about this, you know, the way different emotions, in compassion-focused therapy, which is the area I talk about, we talk about 3 different classes of emotions. We talk about emotions that we call threat emotions like anger, fear, anxiety. And these are emotions that really come up when we perceive a threat to us and like powerfully motivate us to do something in response to that. And then there are drive emotions that are associated with, I want that, I'm going to go get it. And then there are emotions that come about that we call safeness emotions, contentment, peacefulness, connectedness. And what happens is when we're in the midst of these different emotions, they focus us in different ways. And so one of the very tricky things is that the threat emotions, anger, anxiety, fear, and the drive emotions, right, which we could talk about in terms of excitement, ambition, lust. Anytime we see something, oh, I want that, right? Those emotions impact our minds in very powerful ways. When we're experiencing those, our attention tends to narrow, and our thinking tends to narrow. And maybe you've had that experience. There was something that you really wanted or something that you really didn't want, and you found yourself just thinking about that, and everything else kind of falls away. So when we feel safe and connected to others and supported, all of that opens up. And we naturally become reflective. We can ask questions like, what kind of person do I want to be? What are the things that are really important to me? What do I want my life to be about? When we feel angry, we just think about what we're angry about. And all that reflection falls away. So I think a big part of helping ourselves be compassionate is to really become intimately acquainted with the obstacles to compassion, the things that will tend to block it for us. And those sorts of emotions and thoughts, whether it's a thought like, oh, that's what I want and screw everybody else, or if it's an emotion where you're not thinking much at all, you're just thinking about how I get it, I want that, I'm going to go get it. If we can learn to recognize these experiences coming up in us and use that as a cue to shift perspectives to a mindful sort of observing of what we're experiencing, that can be very helpful. So I would encourage you, as you're going through your lives and trying to cultivate compassion, try to begin to notice if you feel a powerful urge either to go after something or to go the other way, to run away. If that urge, instead of following that urge, if that urge itself could be a cue to what's happening here, to really look closely, what's happening in my mind? What am I thinking? What am I feeling? What do I want to do? And is this urgency I feel? Because those emotions carry with them a sense of urgency. Is this urgency about the situation? Is it really called for? Is it really true that I have to do something right now? Or is that just part of this emotion? And could I maybe slow down my breath, slow down my mind, and then think about what it is that really matters to me? Right? Because I think a lot of us, sometimes we have these very powerfully, overtly selfish thoughts. But I think a lot of time, we're not having thoughts at all. We're so caught up in moving toward or away from something that we're not even thinking about. It's not that we don't care about others, we want to hurt them. We're just not thinking about them. So to notice those shifts in our minds, I think, can be very important. And the mindful breathing exercise that we actually opened the practice with today, and just learning to do that. This is something that I teach every one of my patients, and it's not an easy practice, as you know, but it's sort of simple to teach, right? You bring your attention to the breath. When a thought takes you away, you notice and come back. But that simple practice has huge effects. It trains the attention, so you can hold your attention much longer where you want it, and you notice when it moves, when it shifts. And that noticing is very, very important, because if we can notice when the attention shifts, if we can notice movement in the mind, train ourselves to do that through this practice, then when that anger comes up, or the I want that comes up, or the lustful thought comes up, or whatever it is that's getting in the way, we'll be much more likely to catch it and to notice it rather than to just run along with it. And so I think that's very useful, because the moment we notice it, we've got a choice. At that moment, we've got a million choices. There are so many wonderful practices you can do. If you notice, I'm getting really angry right now. I'm finding myself wanting to say something really mean. I'm finding, look, I'm ignoring everybody around me because I want that so badly. Once we're aware of that, there's so many wonderful practices we can do. So, yeah, those are the thoughts I had in response to your comment.
I'd like to ask about this compassion, and you're talking about the difficulty to oblige all the requests for assistance. So I'm suggesting maybe if we apply the triage approach to decide how we should deal with compassion, the first thing is, would that be right? And if it's right, what are the criteria we use to apply this triage? Triage means deciding which is more important, one that we should say yes and which one we say no.
I think, individually, we may do that and have priorities because we have different skills and different interests, different abilities to help. Yeah. However, I think that as a society, we should not do that because then some people really get left out and left behind. Yeah. And the thing is that because we're all different, we're going to be incited by compassion for different kinds of people or different animals, different kinds of living beings. And so on an individual basis, we will set our priorities differently about who we're going to extend our help to, considering, all our own limited abilities. And I think that's good because then that way, everybody who is in need can at least receive some help. And everybody who wants to help can find a way to do according to their own abilities. Mm-hmm.
So I had kind of two thoughts too. I think having an awareness of what I can do and also how do I support changes in society is very important. In terms of manifesting compassion in your life, in terms of what you can do, I'd encourage you to think about what are the things that are really important to you. What are the things that get your passion going? Because what you find is that you want to keep going. You want to keep your motivation high. One of the wonderful things about Buddhism is that in contrast to many other religions and psychology, there's this real recognition from the very beginning that changing the mind and working with suffering really requires a lot of effort over a long period of time. It requires consistent practice, and there's a real recognition around that. And so there are practices, for example, contemplating precious human birth, contemplating impermanent, that are specifically designed to keep your motivation high, so you keep going. And so I think if you find something that you can change about the world, or something that fits with your skills that can keep you excited and moving forward in a way that will help you persevere, I think that's very useful. And I think it's useful to also think about what's my skill set, what am I good at? So for example, when I try to manifest my compassion in working with people who are struggling with mental illness or with difficult emotions, and coming and doing talks like this, because these are the things that I can do. I have deep respect for people who run organizations that distribute goods and things like this, but my brain doesn't work my mind, I'm not organized that way. I would be overwhelmed. I couldn't do it. But what I can do is support those organizations in whatever way I can. Maybe it's by volunteering, by going in and saying, what could I do to help your mission? Or by donating what money that I could to support what they're doing. So that even though that's something I don't have the skills to do, that maybe I can empower others to do that too. And so that was the second thought that I have, is that a lot of times when we think about compassion, we may think about what can I do? But I think we also need to think about what can we do, and to work to facilitate connection with others. This is why Sangha is so important, because when we're working together to make the world better, we multiply our efforts. And when we're working together with like-minded people who care about compassion and these values that we have, it keeps our motivation high. It supports us. When we start to struggle, we've got someone then we can share with and talk about, who can understand what we're feeling and validate us and say, oh yes, it makes sense to me that you're feeling this way. It's okay, let's keep going together. And that sense of we makes all of us much more powerful. And I think the more we expand that we to include people that maybe initially we're not so familiar with, it empowers all of us to make much more change. And in terms of the way we work, remember I talked about threat, keeps us focused, cripples us in terms of our ability to compassion. Well, when we feel safe, we open up, we naturally tend to be more altruistic, more pro-social. And the primary way most human beings feel safe is through connection with others that accept us, that value us. And so, again, thinking in terms of what can I do, but also what can we do? How can I connect and support systems devoted to compassion?
Thank you.
Sometimes you want to be kind to someone, but it's very difficult to get along, very difficult to speak gently, but you have to be wrathful with compassion. If you speak nicely, it will never work. So sometimes you have to be, nasty, but it is with compassion. Behind it, you have compassion, you have love, you have concern for them, So it's just like to be cruel is to be kind. It's a paradox, but it's okay to be, sometimes.
Okay. I think a lot of things depend on specific situations. I agree, sometimes you have to speak very assertively, very forcefully to get a point across to somebody, because otherwise they just space out and they don't pay attention. And I know that. I mean, whenever you're in a leadership position, it can be really difficult, because sometimes you have to be very straightforward, very direct with people, because otherwise they don't wake up and understand what's going on, And so sometimes, in order to be compassionate and explain things to people in that way, you run the risk of them not liking you afterwards, because you have to say something that maybe they don't want to hear, or you have to say it in a very firm way that, again, isn't pleasant to their ears. Yeah, so it's one of those things where you have to step back and say, okay, what is the most skillful thing to do right now? Is it more skillful in the long term to speak nicely, let this go, and see what develops? Or is it more skillful in the long term to really directly confront this right now? Yeah. Anybody who is the parent of a teenager knows what I'm talking about. Yeah, don't you? If you're a parent, you face this all the time. Do you speak gently, or do you, speak forcefully? It's not so easy. So, you have to evaluate what the situation calls for. You also have to look closely at what your own motivation is, because we have a tendency to rationalize our motivations. I'm going to spank you for your own good because I love you so much. Okay, did you ever hear that as a kid? Yeah? Did you believe that? No. Yeah? I don't tend to believe that either, because the expression on the parent's face isn't one of I love you at that moment. They may love us at other moments, they may love us long term, but at that moment they are fed up. Yeah? And they're doing it as a last cause, a last effort to do something, because they're so frustrated and they don't know what else to do. So we can't really say that's compassionate. Okay, we can still have compassion for them, because it's not pleasant to be a parent in that kind of situation at all. Okay, but it doesn't mean that that's compassionate behavior on their part. Yeah. So all these things, I think, so often we need to look at specific situations and specific people. And it can be very dangerous to make broad, general statements. Sometimes in a talk like this, somebody may ask a question that I can tell they're actually talking about a personal situation that they're confronting, but they're presenting it as a general question. And when I think that's happening, I often, not always, avoid, just say that flat out. I don't think it's fair for me to answer a general question which you're going to take as specific advice for your situation, because I don't know all the factors of your situation. Yeah. So in these kinds of things, we really have to stop and pause and look.
I think this is a very good question. And if you read various stories of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, you'll see stories of, smacking somebody and they get enlightened. So we do. There are these stories. I'm not just making this up, right? You're familiar with this. So we read this and we think, oh, see, wrathful action is important. And I understand that in the Buddhist context, the word wrathful has a meaning that I'm reacting to that word in a way that isn't consistent with the meaning in Buddhism. But when I hear wrathful, I think it sets us up. I think the Buddha and many bodhisattvas had the wisdom to know when wrathful action, I think, would be very appropriate. I don't know that I have the wisdom. So I would use words like assertive, but so to me, I would aspire to never, if I can avoid it, behave wrathfully. Because to me, that almost feels like even if it's not motivated by anger, I'm expressing anger. It comes across this way, and maybe that can be helpful for people. But when I think about how anger organizes the mind of people, I think that if someone's perceiving anger from my side, how are they going to think about me? How are they going to think about my respect if that's what they're getting from me, regardless of what my underlying motivation is? So I would encourage you. I think sometimes it's clear you need to be assertive and you need to speak very directly and say what you mean and what you need. And I think that's great. But I would encourage folks, if you're having a situation like this with somebody and you're starting to make judgments, okay, I need to put this person in their place, or something like this. At that point, this is a general instruction I gave yesterday, and I'll give it again because I think it's very important. When you notice your mind going into judging and labeling others, see if you can pause and instead seek to understand. And maybe ask questions. For me, compassionate reasoning very often takes the form of asking questions. And so if I was in that situation with that person you were talking about, I would ask questions like, what's going on in their mind that the way they're behaving and acting makes sense to them? Because it seems clearly inappropriate to me. I don't like it, but if they're behaving that way, there's some way that it makes sense for them. And if I can understand how it makes sense for them, what are the underlying needs, what are the underlying motivations, the stuff that's going on with them, I'm much more likely to be able to interact skillfully with them. In therapy, this is very important because there are sometimes, let me tell you, there's so many times therapy would go so much more quickly. My patients would get better so much more quickly if I could just say, you need to stop doing that and do this. And if that worked, I could cure people in 2-3 sessions. But it doesn't work. It doesn't work, And the other problem with speaking like sternly and saying, okay, you need to do this, is that it creates a power or reinforces a power hierarchy where I'm up here. I'm the one who gets to tell you what to do. And you're the one who needs to listen and do it. And sometimes you're in a situation where there's a natural hierarchy already. Maybe you're the abbess of an abbey. Maybe you're the supervisor at a job. Maybe you're the professor with a research team and with students. But the problem is, if I interact with that person in a way that reinforces that hierarchy, that communicates to them that I have the power and you don't, does that motivate them to do better? Does that so if I want someone to change, my strategy actually is to empower them And if I'm the supervisor, if I'm the therapist, if I'm the professor, if I'm the abbess, I don't have to remind people of my power. I've got it, right? That's there. And hopefully the way I manifest that is by modeling the sort of behavior I would like to see from them, by setting an example that inspires them to do better. So if I had that person you're talking about, and it doesn't work as well with my 9-year-old all the time, but sometimes, I might say, well, I need to talk to you about this situation that's happening. This is what's happening. And I'll describe what I see from them, but I describe it in the context of the situation. This is what's happening here, and this is what needs to happen. Do you have any ideas about how we could work with this? So instead of it being me versus you, it's us together working on this obstacle. I have to say, I'm so glad you do that, because I realize I'm almost gesturing there, and that would be very bad. on this obstacle. My foot can be the obstacle. So does this make sense? So I think that being assertive and speaking directly are wonderful, and they're things that we will often need to do to deal with situations. But before we do that, we want to look deeply and try to understand the situation and to try to understand what's going on in the mind of the other person. And then whatever action we take is much more likely to be skillful. And a good clue that tells us I need to try and understand better is when we feel the urge to say it now. Right? That's a clue to me that this motivation is about me. It's about what I want or what I don't want, not necessarily about what would serve the situation best.
Sometimes, provided the person acknowledge that he or she has a problem, that comes to seek help first, right? I mean, you help them to think, but that's assuming that they acknowledge they have a problem and they want to deal with the problem. Some may be too engrossed into it that they don't even realize it, and they continue to be, Mm-hmm. So how do we help them to first acknowledge a problem before, like we say, go about helping them?
So I think there are a number of ways to do that, but in therapy, there's one way to do this is something called Socratic Dialogue, right? So you will be familiar with this because therapists aren't the only ones who use Socratic Dialogue, right? So the idea is, rather than saying to someone, okay, you've got a problem and here it is, you explore, which won't work, you explore the situation and say, this is kind of what I've observed. I hear you saying this, and I see this happening, and I hear, what do we make of this? Right? And so get them to think. The idea is you're trying to create a process of guided discovery where the person makes realizations and go, oh my gosh, look, when I do that, that causes real problems for me. So I have a lot of clients who come in, for example, who are depressed, who are very self-critical and tell themselves that I'm no good, I'm, whatever. And the idea is if I attack myself, if I insult myself enough, that will motivate me to do better. And so if I propose to them that maybe that's not the case, they can be very resistant. But instead I might say, okay, I want you to imagine that you have a child that you love very much, and they're learning a very difficult task like playing a musical instrument. And imagine them having one of two teachers. On one hand, they have a teacher who's very harsh and critical and says, no, wrong, no. Are you stupid? What's wrong with you? And on the other hand, they've got a teacher who realizes that this is a very difficult task. Imagine having a compassionate teacher who gets this is a difficult task, and what you really need is just to keep the child practicing and keep going and keep trying, because that's how you get better. Who's saying, oh, this is very difficult, but you keep going. Good job. Nice. No, not quite like that. More like, there you go. There you go. Keep going. Keep trying. Which teacher would you want your child to have? You'd want the second one, wouldn't you? Which teacher do you think would help your child learn better? Probably the second one. When you watch yourself struggling, which teacher does the voice in your head sound most like? Yeah. And sometimes the client goes, oh, okay, I get it.
So assuming someone gives you a task to do, and you feel compassion about the cause, but sometimes you have to say no to it. And then you feel guilty about it. So are there any steps, any mental procedures to take to eradicate that guilt before it manifests into a certain form of resentment towards yourself or towards that particular task, for example?
So a moment ago, I was talking a little bit about Socratic Dialogue, right? And that might be a situation that you could use Socratic Dialogue with to ask your question, you know. So you're feeling guilty. If you were telling me this and we were sitting together, I might said, so you're feeling very guilty for not doing this. But it sounds like you had some good reasons for not doing that. Is that right? Yeah. So, and that I might maybe have you talk about those reasons. And what I might do is even ask you to imagine if someone you cared very much about was faced with a similar dilemma and that they had said no because they, you know, for very good reasons, and that they were feeling guilty about it. And I might even have you imagine how you would feel toward them and how maybe you'd understand that, gosh, their guilt makes sense. They want to help so badly that they feel bad when they can't. And does that make sense? And I try to have you imagine, you know, feel compassion and warmth toward them, and then try to help you bridge that toward yourself to recognize that actually the reason you're feeling guilty is that I care so much, I want to help so much. Well, what does that say about you? That you want to help so badly that you feel bad when you can't, you know? And to kind of see how that makes sense and have you explore it, right? Because again, if I just say, oh, you don't need to feel guilty about that, that's going to bounce right off, right? That's not going to make any sort of sense at all. But if I help you explore, and part of that, this is very important, habits, when we think certain things over and over and over, they get staying power in the mind. One of the things Buddhists talk about a lot that's really important, and neuroscience bears it out in terms of what happens physically in the brain too, is that when we think a certain way or behave a certain way in the present, we're not just doing something right now, but we're also creating the causes and conditions that make it much more likely that we will think or behave that way in the future. And so if you have the habit of feeling guilty when you say no, that can be a very powerful thing that's in your mind. And so just saying, oh, I shouldn't feel guilty about this isn't necessarily going to make that feeling go away immediately. So, but if we can change your relationship to that guilt, so when you see it, you go, oh, look, thank you, guilty self, for showing up. This is a sign of how much I want to care, how much I care, and that's a good thing. But I know that taking care of myself is actually part of compassion, and that when I do that, when I can help, I will do so effectively and skillfully. And to begin to have that dialogue with yourself so that when you hear that self-critical voice coming up, you have a compassionate response that you can sort of coach yourself through.
How do you handle people who like to twist and turn words and make empty promises? You mean they kind of talk ambiguously and go around in circles and don't really say much and say a lot but without saying much, and then leave you sitting here wondering why Russell's going to answer the question? People like that? Is that who you're talking about? Okay. So for me personally, you know, if somebody is speaking in a very vague way, then, you know, and we're working together on a project or something and I need more details, then I will ask them, you know, please could you unpack that a little bit and tell me, you know, I need more details to know exactly what's going on. And similarly, I feel if somebody is getting in over their heads, maybe it's not an empty promise. Empty promise kind of assumes that the person is doesn't really want to help. Yeah, but they're saying they are. But it could be very much like they want to help, but they don't really assess what they're able to do, so they overcommit. Yeah, so often if I sense that somebody is overcommitting, I'll stop and I'll say, okay, well, what idea do you have for, for doing this? You've just said that you would like to do this. Could you unpack for me a little bit, what you would like to do or when you would like to do it? And in the process of, having that discussion, see for myself and also get them to see if it's really the right thing for them to commit to at that particular time. Yeah, that's much more effective, again, than saying, are you making an empty promise? That doesn't work so well.
When I'm working with my graduate students on a major research project, like their thesis, for example, sometimes they'll come in and they'll say, I'll say, okay, I need you to do this and this and this. And they'll say, oh yes, I'll do that, And then they go off and it doesn't happen. Yeah. And I should say, actually, and this is not only my first visit to Singapore, but it's my first visit to Asia, period. And so it's wonderful. But before I came, I was aware that I would probably be culturally ignorant and wanted to minimize the extent that I would do like terribly offensive things or things like this. So I went online and I read a little bit about the culture, and one of the things that they said is that Asian cultures tend to be a little less direct, right? So instead of saying, no, I'm not going to do that, the way people do in the United States, we're very direct, there might be something like, well, I'll see if I can get to that. Right?
No. That's too direct.
Is it too direct?
That's too direct.
So you begin, and I think for Westerners that come here, it can be very confusing because we can walk away with the idea that someone said yes when you would know that actually they said no, there's no way in heck I'm doing that. But what they said was, well, we'll see. In the Middle East, there's a phrase, and I can't remember the phrase, but the phrase basically means if God wills it, which means no. It said, I'm not going to do that. Maybe God will do that. I'm not going to do it. But I have found with my graduate students, oftentimes when they do those things, it's because they have a good intention, but they don't really understand the specifics of what will need to be done. And so what happens is they go away and they try to get started, but then they realize how vague it was for them. Maybe they didn't even realize when they were with me, and then they don't do it, and they get very anxious because they can't do it, so they avoid me. So what I have learned to do when I'm working with graduate students, every time now, every meeting I have with my students before they leave my office, I say, okay, do you know exactly what to do next? Do you know the specific steps that you need to do to carry out this task? And I say it very, very overtly. I say, because I don't want you leaving my office finding out that you don't know what to do and then being anxious about displeasing me. So so I have them tell me specifically what they're going to do. And I also say, and if you get anxious or if you feel like you're not quite sure, come back and ask. And I try to make it safe for them to do that. And I know another thing that I saw when I was on the internet reading about Asian culture is that you're a little less emotionally expressive maybe, right? A little less likely to say, okay, I'm feeling anxious or I'm, those sorts of things. And I would encourage you, I don't want to challenge anything culturally, but among the people that you feel comfortable with, I'd encourage you to play with that a little bit and see if you say, well, I'm feeling a little anxious about this project because I don't quite know what to do, and see what sort of response you get and see if, I don't know, maybe because...
That is losing face.
I know, well, again, just write that off as this is the Westerner that doesn't understand anything. But what I have found is actually talking about, oh, look at this, I'm so naive. You're looking at me like I'm crazy. I just lost all of my credibility. Okay. You don't have to. The reason I said that, and there is a lot of cultural ignorance, obviously, here on my side, but when I was much younger, and in our culture, people are much more emotionally expressive, but among men, much less so. There's a lot more permission for women to express their emotions, but for men, it's okay to be angry. But you can't be sad, you can't be anxious, you can't be scared, right? You can't do that. And so one of the things, so I was very scared about expressing myself in those ways. And over the years, largely because I went into psychology, I started taking some chances and trying that out. And once I found that actually everything didn't go horribly wrong, now it doesn't bother me. There's no anxiety around that. So confidence can build. But obviously, you're the ones who know what your lives are like, and you've got to decide what you're going to do based on what feels comfortable for you. Yeah.
When I tell people like that, like they tell me a problem with their boss, because like I said, everybody hates their boss. And I say, go talk to your boss, and, just say, I don't understand, or I feel anxious. And they looked at me. They look at me like I told them to drop dead. It's like, do that. Who in their right mind would ever do that? And if I can give you a little cultural lesson.
Please do. I need it desperately. I can tell.
I learned this when I first came to Singapore in 1987. Okay, just a small incident. I was walking down the street with somebody, and she said, "Shall we cross to the other side?" And I was busy thinking yes or no, and she was already crossing. So a question often is an instruction.
Yeah.
Yeah?
I appreciate that. I like you.
So it's 12:30. Shall we close? Sit and close your eyes.
She's got it down, doesn't she?
Okay. Yeah. And when people will tell you, that they can't do something because they're doing this and such, and then when you find them doing not this and such, but something else, don't think they lied to you. No. There's a different definition of lying in Asia. Really, seriously, isn't it? If I invite you out to eat and you don't want to come, you have an appointment. And you tell me you have an appointment, but that's not considered lying. It's considered not hurting my feelings by refusing my invitation. Yeah? In America, that's considered lying. Yeah?
I don't know. I could have an appointment with a pizza.
Okay, I think we need to end now.